welcome to NedDev. This episode is about subroutines in Perl. If you've done any programming before, it's likely you've come across functions, and subroutines are just Perl's equivalent of a function. Functions or subroutines are used to do a specific job. This reduces the need to rewrite code when that job is done multiple times. So in this episode we'll go through the functions themselves, unpacking arguments and returning values, and what all of that means. So over in our development environment, I want to create another example file that we can reference later on. So this is our 15th, and I'll call this subroutines. And then, like all of our other files, we need to use the pragmas use, strict, and use warnings. So as we did with if and while statements, we're going to start off by learning the structure and the syntax of a subroutine. There we go. And so how this works is you have the keyword sub, and this is like in other languages where you have in Python, say def, and you're defining a function. Here we're defining a subroutine. So, and then we say the routine name, and then we simply open a scope with curly braces. And inside these braces is where our code that runs lives. So the next thing we want to learn is how to call this, because as it's set there, this is just a defined piece of code that we can call. It doesn't just run. So if I was to run this, nothing happens. Even if I put in here print NedDev, that won't run until we call it. So to call it, we use the subroutine name and open brackets and then close off that statement. And if we run this, then it runs the code. It's worth noting at this point that if you come across some old Perl code, it may look something like this with an ampersand at the beginning, and they will both run. There you go. But this is the old way of doing things, and you shouldn't use it now. So this is simple enough to understand, but let's make a subroutine which takes in an input and does something to that to give an output. And those are known as arguments that you pass in. So Perl being Perl has a different way of doing things. Instead of having, say, function, the function name, open brackets, and then you pass in these inputs with arguments like that, and then use them in the function body. Instead, what we need to do is unpack the arguments. Now, if you've watched my episode on arrays, that'll help a lot, because you do a similar thing. Arguments are passed into a built-in array, and then you take them out and use them within the function. So let's create a subroutine which makes things uppercase. So we pass in a word or a string, and then it makes that string uppercase and prints it out. So as we know, keyword sub, and then make uppercase, and then we open the body. So there are two ways of doing this. What we can do is, I'll show you the two ways in parallel. So we can say my open brackets and string, or whatever you want that string being passed in to be called within the function body or the subroutine body, and then @_. And this @_ contains our arguments. So if we pass in a single argument, that will be the first element of this array. If we pass in two, then there will be two elements within this array, and we could do something like string 2, and then the first element will be passed into the first declaration here, and then the second one into this. So another way to do this will be to use the array function shift. So we could say, I get rid of that to make them equal, so string with no brackets, and then I say shift. Because if you remember from that previous episode, shift will take the first element of the array and everything else shifts up one, and then it returns that first element to whatever you want to use it. So here we're assigning that to a variable called string. Right, so now what we want to do is use this string and make it uppercase. So we can go print uppercase, which is a function all by itself, and then string, and do a new line character to keep things neat. And we can copy this down into here, and we can call that function. So let's call this make uppercase 2, just to differentiate between them. So we can copy that name, do it here, that might make it a bit simpler. Then we can pass in a string, so say Ned, and we can do the same thing here. Pass in a string dev, close those two off and run it. So now you can see I've passed in a string which contains lowercase and a string which contains lowercase down there, and they both get printed out in fully uppercase. It's worth me noting that there are more methods than this, so this is just my preferred method. I think it's the cleanest and scales the best. This is another method that I see a lot, and there are other ways to do it. You are simply just taking that array and doing something with it. These are commonly used ways to use an argument. So you might be asking, can we only pass strings into or scalars into a function? And no, we can pass in anything we like, really, as long as that function is ready to deal with whatever you're passing in. So let's make a subroutine for print hash. So in here, what I want to do is I want to accept a hash. So I can use this similar to this first method, and that can be equal to my array. So each element in this array will become a key and then a value within that hash. Right, let's actually do what the function is meant to do, which is print out our hash values. So let's create an iterator and say for my keys in only the keys of our hash, and what this will do is iterate through the keys of that hash, so then we can access the values of the hash using the keys. Oops. So we can go print and say our hash access the scalar within that hash with the key. Actually makes more sense to call that key rather than keys. And let's do some formatting, create a new line value. So the next thing we want to do is to create a hash to go into this function. We can do that by saying hash of names, and let's just number them. So key 1 is equal to value Ned, key 2 is equal to value dev. Close that off, and now we will call that function and pass in the hash that we just created. So hash of names. There we go. So let's print that out and see if it does what we want it to do. There we go. So we get dev and we get Ned. So far we've just been printing things out from our function. Now most of the time when you come across a Perl project or you create one, you won't necessarily want to just be using a function to print things out. You want to use a function that you give an input and it gives you something back that's useful to then use within your program. So let's comment this out and let's create a mathematical function that sums array elements. Yeah, okie, so there we go, and as you can see there, we want to pass in an array. It expects an array, so we can say array, That can be called whatever you want, but it makes sense to call it array in this context. And we assign our built-in array to our array to use within our function. Now you could just access this directly within the function, but I think it is a lot more readable and cleaner if you assign it to something else with a meaningful name. So the next thing we want to do is sum up the elements within this array. So we can say, let's create a running total. And that can be equal to 0 because we've got nothing in there at the minute. And then we can iterate over this array by saying my x, that can be our iterator, and we pass in the array there. And for each element that we come across in this array, we want to add it to our running total. So we can say our running total is equal to whatever's in our running total plus whatever's in our iterator. And that should do for that. And finally, is what we want to do is give this number back to, because we don't just want to print out the running total, we want to return this number, this total, back to the program that's asked for it. So we can say the keyword return. This is much like other languages, so we can say return and the running total. Cool. Okay, so let's create an array, and yep, my array of nums equal to 4, 5. Okay, so that we know should equal 1, 3, 6, 10, 15. So our function should return 15 if it's written correctly. So you can say that, and array of nums. And there you can see, so we don't know if that's run correctly, because what it's done is returned that number to where we've called it. So to then access that number, we can then print this out. Cool, 15, so we know that works. Returning is effectively exiting that function. So if I was to put a return here and say return finished, then as this executes, it would get to this line, return this, and not execute any of that ever. So you have to make sure you put the return in the right place, and usually that's at the end after you've done anything. So there we can see finished. Now if I was to put this after our other return, then we will get the right answer and we would never get this. Thanks for watching. I know that was a long one, but functions or subroutines are so important and so foundational in programming, it makes sense to spend a disproportionate amount of time here. So please like, dislike, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one where we'll talk about standard input and standard output.